John Schoenherr was born in 1935 in the borough of Queens in New York City. Despite the relatively recent year of his birth, I struggled to find any meaningful information about him, other than that he studied at the weekends at the Art Students League and went on to more regular study at Pratt Institute, from where he graduated in 1956. And it was later in that year that he made his professional debut with illustrations for Amazing Science Fiction magazine. Other commissions followed, and soon enough he was also appearing regularly in the similar Astounding and Infinity magazines. The monochromes he produced at this time were created in the main with scraperboard, also known in the USA as scratchboard. He wasn't alone in the use of this challenging method, but it was certainly only a small number of others who employed it at the time. In the right hands, this technique gave particularly clean, sharply delineated images, which reproduced particularly well, and it was with this monochrome work that Schoenherr first became established. But as the 1950s turned to the 60s, he was increasingly being commissioned to work in colour, and his painted work was every bit as distinctive as his black and white illustration. He'd been influenced, at least to some extent, in his painted style by the technique and imaginative approach of the older and now fairly obscure science fiction artist Richard M. Powers. Schoenherr's favourite medium was egg tempera, but he was also known to work in oils, gouache and watercolour if the mood took him. A lot of the science fiction illustration he created at this time was being published in the magazine Analog, and it was primarily with his work for this magazine that he rapidly built a reputation among a growing number of admirers with fans of the genre. Undoubtedly his most significant body of work for Analog was with the colour cover art and a large volume of page monochromes for a serialisation of Frank Herbert's epic Dune trilogy. Schoenherr's distinctive swirling monochromes paid homage to earlier pulp styling and demonstrated masterful control of pure black and white. But what made these visualizations so distinctive was his brittle linear execution and generally angular approach to the anatomy of his characters. Where others traded heavily on the conventions of the superhero comic book, his images were a considerable distance from such predictable evocations. And such was the general admiration for this collection that it won that year's Hugo Award for Best Science Fiction Illustration. But it was also in 1963 that Schoenherr branched out from science fiction into animal-themed children's book work with the publication of Sterling North's novel Rascal. This narrative about the relationship of a young boy and his endearingly miscreant raccoon inspired a collection of monochrome images which were tightly controlled but expressively executed and yet abundantly emotional in their appeal. In the same year, his illustrated edition of Walt Moray's Gentle Ben was also published. This time the narrative featured a lovable bear, but as he had done in his images with Rascal, Schoenherr completely sidestepped any temptation to anthropomorphise the eponymous character, and yet still successfully imbued him with considerable personality and physical plausibility. But he didn't abandon science fiction work altogether with more monochromes and painted covers for Analog. It was also around this time that Schoenherr, his wife Judy and their daughter Jennifer moved to a 24-acre farm in rural New Jersey. Their second child Ian was born a little later, and he went on to have his own career as a successful children's illustrator. Mr. Miles's 1965 book Mississippi Possum occupied decidedly similar territory to the two previous books, and to an extent was indicative of a certain typecasting in this side of his career now taking place. But the book also saw the introduction of limited overprinted colour in his illustrations, and although they could be considered unnecessary given the quality of his line drawing, they nevertheless added more visual appeal and were tastefully applied. And in 1966 he illustrated another Mr. Miles story, The Fox and the Fire, for which I could unfortunately only find very little to show of good enough quality. There were others of a similar nature also published at this time, among them another Fox-themed book, The Fox and the Hound, written by Daniel P. Mannix and published in 1967. The same story was later very loosely adapted in 1981 for an anthropomorphic Disney feature, which of course bore no resemblance whatsoever to Schoenherr's credible visualization. He continued to perform a creatively productive balancing act between his commitments to analogue alongside the more down-to-earth, rurally themed literature for children. And in 1967 the magazine commissioned him to illustrate the Dragon Riders of Pern stories by Anne McCaffrey, which he carried out with similar creative success as the earlier Dune work. But it was around this time that he started to increasingly favour the illustration of wildlife-themed fiction, and also started to acquire a strong reputation for the quality of his painted wildlife art. In 1968 he also made his own debut as a writer with his illustrated story The Barn, which featured a skunk as the protagonist and a host of other creatures in support. Once more he pulled off the difficult task of imbuing anatomically accurate creatures with personality. And as with so much of his work, the images themselves were matched in quality by their layout on the page, in perfect balance with the printed text and set against large areas of page white. And whether this was something that was in his creative control or he happened to be working with an empathic designer, I really don't know. Among other children's books of this period was another by his by now long-term collaborator Mr. Miles, with 1969's Nobody's Cat, for which it appears he chose to create his images in pen and ink, with the addition of grey washes and a textured orange to focus the reader's attention on the central feline character throughout, this time set in a decidedly urban environment. And a year later there was yet another collaboration with Miles for Eddie's Bear, which returned to his more precise scraperboard technique, overprinted with two suitably earthy colours, which were again used intelligently to draw the reader's eye and enhance the aesthetic qualities of the images. In the early years of the 1970s he returned, to a considerably lesser extent than previously, to science fiction illustration. And most of this was produced as painted cover art for paperback books, although analogue still remained a dependable client. In 1971 he illustrated Jean C. George's Julie of the Wolves, an elegiac story of a young Inuk woman who frees herself from an abusive marriage but struggles to survive in the frozen wastelands of Alaska before becoming adopted by a pack of wolves. And however far-fetched the narrative, Schoenherr brought the mood, climate and harsh environmental concerns of the story to vivid life for the reader with even more scratchy monochromes than usual. There were other books published in the early 70s, but I found no usable examples until 1974's Otter in the Cove, written of course by Mr. Miles. This time the narrative featured a young female protagonist who befriends an otter, which is unfortunately a species her fisherman father is determined to obliterate. And again the environment and emotional complexities of the relationship between the girl and her otter are perfectly evoked by Schoenherr's unsentimental collection of double-page spreads. By this time Schoenherr had developed a well-deserved reputation for the quality of his wildlife art, which was created and sold both as original paintings in a variety of mediums and additionally as offset lithographically printed reproductions for those whose budget didn't stretch to an original. And this reputation led in 1975 to the publication of The Art of Painting Wild Animals, an instructional volume published to give guidance to aspirant artists, showing the various methods and techniques he employed to produce his own dazzling results. It was also in that year that he created this cover for Analog, which by all accounts George Lucas used to inspire his character designers on Star Wars. 1975 was also the year of publication of Faith McNulty's Whales, Their Life in the Sea, another work of non-fiction, and somewhat unexpectedly, the book utilised Schoenherr's impressionistic textured monochromes for the chapter headings rather than the by now more expected photography or photographically realistic paintings. But in 1976 he returned to fiction with Joanne Ryder's story about a mole, Simon Underground. This featured a collection of particularly engrossing scenes, which cleverly mixed cutaway images showing the warren of tunnels carved out by the little creature, with more conventionally depicted images of life above ground. It wasn't exclusively the case, but most were created as double-page spreads, using washes of a limited earthy palette of watercolours with considerable visual engagement. Schoenherr returned to the work of Frank Herbert in 1978 with the serialisation in analogue of The Children of Dune, and most significantly the same year saw the publication of the illustrated Dune, a large format edition of the original book with a mix of black and white drawings and a collection of particularly impressive and atmospheric full-colour paintings. Some of these were also reproduced as an illustrated wall calendar, which, just like the book, sold in unprecedented numbers to fans of what had by now become a classic of its kind. Other illustrators have also created their own visualisation of the books, but Schoenherr's is undoubtedly considered to be the definitive version. Although Herbert and Schoenherr apparently never actually met, the author is recorded as having been particularly impressed with how the illustrator's interpretation chimed with his own. And the illustrations he created for this book undoubtedly had an impact on the film trilogy by director Denis Villeneuve, the first of which was released in 2021. It was also in 1978 that Schoenherr worked again with Miska Miles on her story Beaver Moon. For this book he opted to create his line work in pen and ink with particularly organic application and a two-colour limited palette of equally expressive washes. And from this point onwards it appears that he was now exclusively working as an illustrator of similar books, and with equivalent success with his ongoing creation of breathtaking wildlife art. And the next book I found usable examples from wasn't until 1987, with the publication of Jane Yolen's story Owl Moon. It featured a collection of remarkable double-page spreads rendered in watercolour by Schoenherr, and other than their considerable merits as narrative illustration, they were also stunning compositions, which again used page wipe with great graphic intelligence to incorporate the small amount of finely honed text, making for a perfect symbiosis of writer and illustrator. And he repeated this creative accomplishment with 1991's book Bear, which he also authored. And it was yet another visual highlight among what by now had become a staggering number of equally absorbing and aesthetically accomplished publications. Readers could not fail to be drawn into the simple, short but effective narrative, generally confined to a small corner of double-page spreads, which were breathtaking in their scenic accomplishment, and plausible evocations of unforced animal life in the wild. In 1995 he returned with another of his own stories, in this case a young endearing duck called Rebel, and a series of fine line and watercolour wash pictures which artfully combined above and below water scenes simultaneously without the slightest suggestion of diagrammatic image making. Each spread offered up another atmospheric and completely credible scene, which succeeded in making the viewer feel they were getting a privileged close-quarter glimpse into the life of the ducks and the other woodland creatures. The last dated work I found by Schoenherr was the uncharacteristically humorous Pigs in the Mud, written by Lynn Plord and published in 1997. And it certainly made for an interesting and successful departure for an illustrator so entrenched in more representational character creation. Whether he continued to paint wildlife pictures at this time I couldn't say with any certainty, but equally it seems highly unlikely he would have abandoned that side of his creative impulse. But unfortunately John Schoenherr died in eastern Pennsylvania in 2010 at the age of 74. My admittedly late discovery of some immense talents I was previously unaware of, such as John Schoenherr, has to be one of the things I most enjoy about making these videos. I'm sure there are many science fiction and wildlife enthusiasts, particularly in the USA, who might be scratching their heads wondering how I could not have known about him. All I can say in my defence is that I was fairly occupied with trying to make a living as an illustrator myself for quite a few of the same years as he was enjoying considerably more and well-deserved success. And to further underline the rather obvious statement that Schoenherr was undoubtedly one of the giants of later 20th century illustration, here are a few more for your edification and entertainment.